2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 9,000 artillery guns. The Soviets threw the largest military force ever assembled at one city. But here's the thing. All that firepower couldn't just blast through Berlin. Tanks die in cities. Every window becomes a sniper nest. Every cellar becomes an ambush point. Every street corner is a death trap. So how did they actually crack it? They developed a system. Brutal, methodical, room by room, building by building. They dragged massive howitzers through the streets and fired point blank into apartment blocks. They blasted holes through walls to avoid the streets entirely. They cleared cellars with grenades and flamethrowers while civilians huddled in the corners. Tonight, you're going to experience exactly how the Soviets broke Berlin, from the soldiers who fought it, from the people who survived it, from the streets where it happened. Before we get going, quick thing. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Tonight's stop. Berlin, 1945. Hold up though. Get cozy first. Adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Trust me, once we get going you won't want to move. And now here's where you find yourself. The year is 1945. The date is April 16th. The place is the eastern bank of the Oder River, about 60 kilometers east of Berlin. You're a Soviet soldier, a frontline guy. One of 2.5 million men about to participate in the largest military operation of its kind in history. Your eyes open before dawn, not because you want them to, because the ground is shaking, your whole body is vibrating. The air itself seems to pulse with the deep rolling thunder that doesn't stop. You're lying on cold dirt, maybe a damp greatcoat underneath you if you're lucky. Your boots are still on because you haven't taken them off in 3 days. The smell is a mixture of wet earth, diesel exhaust, cordite, and that particular sourness of men who haven't bathed in weeks. Your stomach growls. Breakfast will be whatever black bread and kasha the field kitchen can scrape together. Maybe some tea if the cooks are feeling generous. Not like your warm bed right now, not like that soft pillow under your head. But here's the thing about this morning. It's different. Because that thunder, that's not a storm. That's nearly 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces opening fire at the exact same moment. Almost 300 guns per kilometre of front, and they're all pointed west. The German positions on the far bank are getting hit with 1.2 million shells on the first day alone. Try to picture that number, 1.2 million explosions in the span of hours. The Germans later described the sound as a dull, continuous roar. Houses shook, pictures fell from walls, telephones rang from the vibrations, and you're part of it. One tiny piece of this massive machine rolling toward Berlin. So who are you exactly? Let's say you're Vladimir Pereverzev, 26 years old. You've got a wife back home who you haven't seen in over a year. You've been fighting since 41, 4 years of this. You've seen friends die in ways you don't talk about. You've walked through villages where everyone was gone. You've lost count of the rivers you've crossed, the trenches you've crawled through, the buildings you've cleared room by room. And now you're here. The final push. Berlin. The plan is simple on paper. Cross the Oder and Neisse rivers. Encircle Berlin. Capture the capital of the enemy who invaded your homeland, killed over 20 million of your people, burned your cities, and tried to erase your entire nation from existence. Simple on paper. The reality is going to be anything but. See, standing between you and Berlin is something called the Seelow Heights. It's a ridge of elevated ground about 90 meters above the surrounding floodplains. The Germans have had months to dig in there. Trenches, bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, tank traps, the whole thing. And your commander, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the guy who saved Moscow, the guy who broke the siege of Leningrad, he's determined to be the one who captures Berlin, not because of ego. Well, okay, maybe a little ego, but also because Stalin has made it very clear that he wants Berlin taken. Fast. And Stalin is not the kind of boss you disappoint. So at 4 in the morning on April 16th, the artillery opens up. You're huddled in your position, hands over your ears, watching the horizon turn orange. The ground literally bounces beneath you. Men are praying. Some are crying. Not from fear, from the sheer, overwhelming sensory assault of it all. Then something weird happens. Zhukov has brought up these massive searchlights, 143 of them. The idea is to blind the German defenders while the infantry advances. Sounds clever, right? Yeah, not so much. What actually happens is the lights hit all the smoke and dust kicked up by the artillery, and instead of blinding the Germans, they create this wall of haze that blinds your own troops. Guys are stumbling forward into the murk, tripping over craters, getting separated from their units. The officers are screaming orders that nobody can hear over the continuous roar of the guns. And the Germans, they're dug in deep. They've been expecting this. When your first waves reach their positions, they open up with everything they've got. Machine guns, mortars, artillery of their own, Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. The casualties start piling up immediately. You push forward anyway. What choice do you have? Orders are orders, and behind you there are political officers who will shoot anyone they catch retreating. That's the reality of the Soviet army in 1945. You advance or you die. Often both. The fighting at Seelow Heights goes on for 4 days. 4 days of hell. You're sleeping in shell craters when you sleep at all, eating when someone shoves food into your hands, shooting at muzzle flashes because that's all you can see through the smoke, dragging wounded friends to aid stations that are overwhelmed with casualties. By the time it's over, 66,000 Soviet soldiers have fallen at Seelow. Some estimates say even higher. 66,000. That's the population of a decent-sized town. Gone. In 4 days. But here's the thing. It works. By April 21st, the German lines are broken. The route to Berlin is open, and Soviet tanks are racing westward at a pace that surprises even the commanders. Meanwhile, a little further south, Marshal Ivan Konev is having an easier time of it. His forces, the First Ukrainian Front, have managed to cross the Neisse River without the same level of carnage. Originally, his job was to swing south of Berlin. But when Zhukov runs into trouble at Seelow, Stalin does something interesting. He tells Konev to turn north, head straight for Berlin. Now you've got 2 Soviet marshals racing each other to capture the city. This is deliberate. Stalin knows that competition breeds results. He also knows that whoever gets to plant the Soviet flag on the Reichstag is going to go down in history. And that kind of glory, that makes men take risks. So here you are, Vladimir, part of this massive wave rolling toward the biggest city in Germany. You've survived Seelow. Barely. Your unit has taken 50% casualties. The guy who shared his tobacco with you 2 days ago is dead. The sergeant who taught you how to throw a grenade back in 42 is missing, probably buried in one of those shell craters. But you're still moving forward, because that's what you do. By April 25th, something remarkable happens. Soviet forces from the north and south link up west of Berlin. The city is surrounded, completely cut off from the rest of Germany. 1.5 million Soviet troops now form a ring around the capital. Inside that ring, about 2.5 million civilians, most of them women, children and old people. The men of fighting age are either dead or defending what's left of the city, and what's left isn't much. Berlin has been bombed over 360 times since the war started. The Americans hit it during the day. The British hit it at night. By April 1945, half the homes in the city are damaged or destroyed. The streets are clogged with rubble. The water system barely functions. The electricity flickers on and off. The sewage system is backed up in most neighbourhoods. People have been living like rats, huddled in cellars, emerging only to stand in food lines that stretch for blocks, always listening for the air raid sirens, always calculating their distance to the nearest shelter. And now it's not just bombs falling from the sky. Now there's a ground army pressing in from every direction. Artillery shells screaming in at all hours, small arms fire crackling in the suburbs, the constant rumble of tanks getting closer. You can feel it through the ground, even in the deepest cellar, that vibration, like the city itself is being shaken apart. For the civilians, this is terror beyond anything they've experienced. The bombs were bad, but bombs are random, impersonal. You can tell yourself that the bomb that kills you wasn't meant specifically for you. It's just statistics. But soldiers are coming with intent. And the stories that have been trickling back from the east about what happens when the Soviets take a city, those stories have people terrified. Some families are hanging white sheets from their windows, surrender flags. Others are digging deeper into their cellars, hoping to wait it out. Others are trying to flee west, hoping to reach the American lines before it's too late. But the ring is closed now. There's nowhere to go. And in the middle of all this chaos, in a bunker 9 meters below the new Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler is still giving orders, still moving armies on maps that no longer correspond to reality, still believing, or pretending to believe, that victory is possible. He's 56 years old. His hands shake constantly. His health is deteriorating. Some of his generals think he's lost his mind, but he's still in charge, still demanding that Berlin be defended to the last man. So that's what's happening. That's the situation on the ground by late April 1945. You, Vladimir Pereverzev, have just spent 4 days in hell at Seelow. You've lost friends. You're exhausted beyond anything you've ever experienced. You haven't slept more than an hour at a stretch in a week. Your uniform is caked with mud and blood that isn't all yours. And now you're marching toward the biggest urban battle of your life. The city sprawls out ahead of you, smoke rising from 100 different fires, the sound of artillery almost constant now. Your officers are pushing hard, always forward, always faster. Stalin wants Berlin captured by May 1st, International Labour Day, a symbolic date on the Soviet calendar. May 1st is 2 weeks away, but 2 weeks in combat feels like 2 years, and between you and that date lies a city of 2.5 million people and whatever remains of its defenders. Some of those defenders are hardened soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front who've been fighting as long as you have, men who know that surrender probably means death, so they might as well go down fighting. But many of them aren't soldiers at all. They're old men pulled from their homes and given rifles they barely know how to use. They're boys, some as young as 14, drafted into the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, handed Panzerfausts and told to stop tanks. Imagine being 14 years old and being told to stand in the path of a Soviet T-34. The average life expectancy of a Volkssturm fighter in Berlin is measured in hours. But that's the situation. That's what Hitler's last orders have created. A city turned into a fortress manned by grandfathers and children, and you're the one who's going to have to take it. Your throat is dry. Your stomach is churning. Somewhere behind you, a field kitchen is setting up. Maybe you'll get hot food tonight. Maybe not. Either way, you'll keep moving. Because that's what you've been doing for 4 years. Because that's what survival means in this army. You think about your wife, about the letter you should write if you get a chance, about whether you'll live long enough to see her face again. The city glows orange on the horizon, fires burning somewhere deep in its heart. In a few days you'll be inside those streets, fighting house to house, room to room, but right now you're just one exhausted soldier in a sea of exhausted soldiers, all of you moving toward the same burning destination. Berlin awaits, and the worst is still to come. But let's slow down for a second. Let's talk about what it actually feels like to be part of this advance. Because it's one thing to read about 2.5 million soldiers, it's another thing entirely to be one of them. You're walking. That's most of what you do. Walking. Your feet ache constantly. Your boots were never quite the right size, and after 4 years, they're held together with wire and willpower. The blisters on your heels have hardened into calluses so thick you barely feel them anymore. Your pack weighs maybe 40 pounds. Rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, mess kit, whatever personal items you've managed to keep through 4 years of war. Maybe a photograph of your wife. Maybe a letter you haven't had time to read yet. Maybe just a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper for when you finally get a moment to write home. The column stretches out ahead of you and behind you as far as you can see. Thousands of men moving in the same direction. Trucks rumbling past when the roads are good enough. Tanks clanking along on the flanks. Artillery pieces being towed by teams of horses or tractors, depending on what's available. The noise is constant. Engines, boots, men talking, coughing, cursing. The distant thump of shells landing somewhere up ahead. The whine of aircraft overhead. Mostly yours now, but you still flinch every time you hear it. Old habits die hard, and through it all that smell, diesel and smoke and sweat and something else, something you've learned to recognize over 4 years, the smell of death, bodies that haven't been buried yet, animals killed in the crossfire, buildings still smouldering from yesterday's fighting. You learn to breathe through your mouth when it gets bad. You learn not to look too closely at the shapes by the side of the road. You learn to keep moving no matter what you see. Because stopping is not an option. Stalin wants Berlin. Zhukov wants glory. Your officers want to survive long enough to see victory. And you just want to go home. But home is still so far away. And between you and home lies the biggest city in Germany, defended by people with nothing left to lose. The sun is setting now, orange and red bleeding into a sky already thick with smoke. Somewhere up ahead, Berlin is burning. You can see the glow even from here, like a second sunset in the wrong direction. Your unit is digging in for the night. Foxholes if you're lucky, shell craters if you're not. The ground is cold and wet, but you've slept in worse, much worse. Someone passes around a canteen. Vodka, maybe. Or that awful home-brewed stuff that tastes like paint thinner. You take a swig and pass it along. The warmth spreads through your chest, helps with the shaking. Tomorrow you'll be closer, the day after closer still. And soon, maybe in just a few days, you'll be inside those streets, fighting in a city that's already half destroyed, looking for enemies in every window, every doorway, every pile of rubble. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you close your eyes. You try not to think about what's coming. You try not to think about the 66,000 who fell at Seelow. Try not to think about your name being added to some list somewhere. You think about your wife instead, about her face, about the last time you held her, about what you'll say when you finally see her again, if you see her again. The ground rumbles. Distant artillery never really stops anymore, just becomes background noise, part of the landscape. You pull your coat tighter, close your eyes, and somewhere in the darkness, Berlin waits. Now let's talk about what Vladimir and the rest of those Soviet soldiers were actually walking into. Because Berlin in April 1945 wasn't just a city, it was a maze, a death trap designed to chew up tanks and spit out their crews. Picture this. You've got wide boulevards lined with massive stone buildings, 4, 5, 6 stories tall. Every window is a potential firing position. Every rooftop could have a machine gun nest. Every cellar entrance could be hiding someone with a Panzerfaust waiting to put a rocket through your tank's side armour. And the streets themselves, they run straight for blocks. Which sounds fine until you realise that a straight street is basically a shooting gallery. One anti-tank gun at the end of a boulevard can destroy every vehicle that tries to come down it. The Germans knew this. They'd been fighting in cities for years. Stalingrad taught them exactly how to turn urban terrain into a nightmare. So here's what they did with Berlin. They divided the city into defensive sectors, like slicing a pie. Each sector had its own commander, its own troops, its own artillery. The idea was that even if one sector fell, the others could keep fighting. You couldn't just punch through one spot and call it a day. You had to grind through every single piece. And at the centre of all these sectors, the Z zone, Z for Zentrum, centre, the heart of the city, the last stand. This zone was roughly bounded by 2 waterways. The Landwehr Canal to the south, the Spree River to the north. Between them sat the buildings that mattered most to the people running what was left of Germany. The old Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse. Göring's massive air ministry building, this enormous stone block that still stands today if you ever visit Berlin. The older New Reich Chancellery buildings, and behind those, about 9 metres underground, the bunker complex where Hitler was holed up, giving orders to armies that barely existed anymore. Further north you had the Brandenburg Gate, the Hotel Adlon, which by this point had been turned into a field hospital, wounded soldiers packed into rooms that used to host foreign dignitaries and movie stars. And then there was the target, the building that Stalin had decided would be the symbol of Soviet victory. The Reichstag. Now here's the funny thing about the Reichstag. It hadn't actually been used as a government building since 1933. A fire gutted it back then, and the parliament never moved back in. By 1945 it was basically an empty shell, a ruin even before the final battle started. But Soviet propaganda had built it up as the heart of the fascist state, the ultimate prize. Stalin wanted the hammer and sickle flying from its roof by May 1st, International Labour Day, a date that meant something back in Moscow. So that's where everyone was heading. That bombed-out, burned-out building that hadn't served any real purpose in over a decade. Thousands of men were going to die fighting over a symbol. War is like that sometimes. But before anyone could reach the Reichstag, they had to get through the rest of the city, and the defences, while not exactly world-class at this point, were still deadly. The Germans had filled trams with rubble and pushed them across intersections to create barricades. They dug anti-tank ditches across major roads. They'd bricked up windows in key buildings and filled them with sandbags, turning apartments into bunkers. Were these defences going to stop 2.5 million Soviet soldiers backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft? No. Everyone knew that. Even the Germans knew that. But they could slow things down. They could make the Soviets pay for every block, every building, every room. And who was manning these defences? That's where it gets rough. Some of them were real soldiers, veterans who'd been fighting on the Eastern Front for years. Men from units like the Müncheberg Panzer Division or the Nordland Division. Tough, experienced fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. But most of them weren't. Most of them were Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Old men in their 60s and 70s who'd served in the First World War and were now being handed rifles and told to stop tanks. Kids as young as 14 pulled out of school and given a Panzerfaust with maybe an hour of training. One account describes a Volkssturm unit where the youngest member was 12 and the oldest was 73. 12 years old, standing in a trench with a weapon he barely knew how to use, waiting for Soviet tanks to come rolling down the street. The average life expectancy for these guys once the fighting started? Hours, sometimes minutes, but they were there. Because the alternative was being shot by the SS for desertion, or having your family punished, or just having nowhere else to go. The city was surrounded, the war was lost, and still, somehow, people kept fighting. Inside the cellars, the civilians waited. 2.5 million of them, mostly women and children at this point. The men were either dead, captured, or standing in those trenches with rifles they didn't know how to use. The cellars had become their world. Every apartment building in Berlin had a reinforced basement designed to survive bombing raids. After 360 air attacks, people had gotten pretty good at cellar living. They knew which buildings had the strongest shelters. They knew the tunnel systems that connected one cellar to another so you could escape if your building collapsed. They'd set up little communities down there, candles for light since the electricity was mostly gone, buckets for toilets since the sewage system had failed. Whatever food they could scrounge, carefully rationed because nobody knew how long this would last. And they listened, always listening, to the bombs falling, to the artillery getting closer, to the small arms fire that meant the ground fighting had reached their neighbourhood. The worst sound was when the firing stopped, because that meant one side had won, and you were about to find out which side it was. Now let's talk about how the Soviets actually fought their way through this mess, because this is where it gets interesting. This is the how that you came here for. By 1945, the Red Army had learned some hard lessons about urban combat. Stalingrad had nearly broken them. They'd lost entire divisions fighting house to house against the Germans. They weren't about to make the same mistakes again. So they developed a system. First, reconnaissance. Before attacking a building, they'd send small teams forward to figure out where the defenders were positioned, which windows had machine guns, which cellars had anti-tank teams, where the officers were located. Then came the artillery, and not just any artillery. They brought up massive howitzers, 203mm guns designed to destroy fortifications. They dragged these monsters through the streets and positioned them to fire over open sites. Direct fire, point-blank range. Imagine a gun designed to lob shells over 20 kilometers being used to shoot at a building 50 meters away. The shells would punch through walls like paper. One round could collapse an entire section of a building. They'd hammer a position until it was rubble, then they'd send in the infantry. But here's the clever part. They didn't just charge down the streets. That's how you get massacred. Instead, they went through the buildings themselves. Soviet assault teams would enter a structure, clear it room by room, then blast holes through the walls into the next building. They'd move from apartment to apartment, floor to floor, without ever stepping into the killing ground of the street. They called it mouse-holing. You punch a hole through a wall, throw a grenade through, wait for the boom, then go through shooting. The Germans in the next building would be waiting for an attack from the front door. Instead, the Soviets came through the bedroom wall. Flamethrowers were common, horrible weapons, but effective for clearing rooms and cellars. The sound alone was sometimes enough to make defenders surrender. Sometimes. And the tanks. The Soviets learned to use them differently in cities. They'd hug the sides of buildings, using the walls for cover. They'd mount submachine gunners on the hull who would spray every window and doorway as they passed. They'd work in pairs, one tank covering while the other advanced. It was slow, brutal, exhausting, and it worked. Block by block, the Soviet forces ground their way toward the center, the Z-zone, the Reichstag, the bunker where Hitler was sending out orders that nobody could follow anymore. The defenders fell back, those who could. Many were surrounded and destroyed where they stood. The Volkssturm kids and grandpas were dying by the hundreds. The veteran units were being whittled down to handfuls of survivors, and in the cellars, the civilians pressed themselves against the walls and prayed to whatever they believed in, praying that when the door finally opened, whoever came through it wouldn't hurt them. Some of them were hanging white sheets from their windows, surrender flags, hoping it would help. It usually didn't make much difference either way. By April 27th, the city was cut off completely. No supplies coming in, no one getting out. The Soviet ring had closed tight. The defenders who were still fighting had been pushed back to the inner sectors. The Z-zone was almost within reach. The Reichstag, visible now from Soviet forward positions, still stood among the ruins, damaged, burned. But still standing, and that's where everyone was heading. Somewhere in the Soviet lines, Vladimir Pereverzev was writing a letter to his wife. He'd found a quiet corner in a half-destroyed building, a stub of pencil, a scrap of paper. The words came slowly. What do you say to someone when you might be dead tomorrow? He wrote that he was alive, that he was healthy more or less, that he'd been drinking a little to keep his courage up. Everybody did that. The daily vodka ration was the only thing that made this bearable. He told her he was just 500 meters from the Reichstag now, that the enemy would be finished in a few days. He tried to sound confident, optimistic. Then he wrote about something she'd mentioned in her last letter. Their kitchen ceiling had partially collapsed back home. She was worried about it. Vladimir told her not to worry. A 6-story building had collapsed on his unit yesterday, he wrote, and they'd had to dig their friends out of the rubble. A kitchen ceiling was nothing. This is how we live, he wrote. This is how we beat the Germans. He folded the letter, stuffed it in his pocket. Maybe he'd find a way to send it. Maybe not. Either way, he'd said what he needed to say. Outside, the artillery was still falling. The fires were still burning. The city was dying, and he was watching it happen. But he wasn't dead yet. And tomorrow, maybe, he'd be one of the men who planted that flag. Or maybe he'd be one more body in the rubble. Either way, it would be over soon. One way or another, it would be over soon. But let's zoom out for a second. Let's look at what the actual battlefield looked like around that Reichstag building, because it wasn't just a straight shot from the Soviet lines to the front door. Between the advancing Red Army and their target sat a mess of obstacles. The Spree River curved through this part of the city, and to reach the Reichstag you had to cross it somehow. That meant bridges, and bridges in a city under siege are death traps. The two key crossings were the Moltke Bridge and the Crown Prince Bridge. Both were mined. Both were covered by defensive positions. Both would become the scenes of some of the worst fighting of the entire battle, and right in front of the Reichstag itself. A flooded construction site. The Germans had been building a new subway line before the war. When the fighting got close, that excavation pit filled with water, creating this weird artificial moat. Any assault on the building would have to funnel around this obstacle, right into the teeth of the German guns. The Reichstag itself had been turned into a fortress. The windows were bricked up and sandbagged. Machine gun positions covered every approach. 3 powerful 88mm guns sat in the square in front. Those versatile weapons that could destroy tanks and shoot down aircraft alike. About 300 men garrisoned the building. Some were SS troops who knew they'd be shot if they surrendered anyway. Others were sailors from the German Navy, rushed to Berlin when there was no navy left to sail. Others were whoever was left, scraped together from a dozen shattered units. They knew what was coming. They knew they couldn't stop it. But they were going to make the Soviets pay for every metre. Beyond the Reichstag, you had other strong points. The Interior Ministry building, sometimes called Himmler's House, sat overlooking the Moltke Bridge. The Kroll Opera House, badly damaged but still defensible, covered the western approach. The Diplomatic Quarter, now just a collection of ruins, still offered cover for German snipers and anti-tank teams. If you look at this battlefield today, it's almost impossible to picture. The area around the Reichstag is now called the Square of the Republic. Tourists take photos in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Kids play on the grass. The modern Chancellery building, all glass and steel, sits where bombed-out ruins once stood. But in April 1945, this was the most dangerous patch of ground in Europe. Meanwhile, in those cellars beneath the fighting, the waiting continued. Gerda was 17 years old in 1945. She'd grown up in Berlin. She remembered the city before the war, the cafes, the movies, the life that seemed normal back then. By April, all she remembered was survival. Her family had made a routine of it. When the air raid sirens went off, down to the cellar, wait for the all clear, check the building for damage, stand in line for rations, repeat. But this was different. The ground fighting meant there were no more all clears. The danger was constant, 24 hours a day. The rumble of artillery, the crack of rifles, the crash of buildings collapsing nearby. In her cellar there were maybe 30 people, mostly women, a few old men, some children who'd stopped crying days ago because what was the point? The air was thick and stale. The single candle provided just enough light to see shapes moving in the darkness. They could hear the fighting getting closer, could feel the building shake when shells landed nearby, could sometimes hear shouting in the street above, though they couldn't tell what language it was. German? Russian? Did it matter anymore? Someone had a radio, but it only picked up the official broadcasts, and those had stopped making sense days ago. Talk of wonder weapons, talk of armies that would come to save Berlin. Everyone knew it was lies, but some people kept listening anyway. Something to do besides wait. The worst part was the not knowing. Were the Russians on this street yet? The next street? Was that explosion getting closer or further away? Would they come tonight? Tomorrow? Ever? Gerda's mother kept her close, told her to stay quiet, told her that when the soldiers came, whatever soldiers they were, to not make eye contact, to not say anything, to not resist anything. The stories from the east had reached Berlin. Everyone knew what happened when cities fell. Everyone knew what could happen to women when armies rolled through. But what choice did they have? The cellar was all that was left. The city above was dying. All they could do was wait and hope that when it was over, they'd still be alive to see whatever came next. That was Berlin in late April. Soldiers dying in the streets, civilians hiding in the dark, a city being torn apart building by building, and at the centre of it all that burned-out shell of a parliament building that everyone was fighting to reach. The night settled over Berlin. Cold for April. The smoke blocked out whatever stars might have been visible. Somewhere in the distance, machine gun fire rattled through the darkness. Someone's last stand. Vladimir tried to sleep. Tomorrow would be worse than today. It always was. But at least tomorrow would be one day closer to the end. April 28th. The men of the 3rd Shock Army reached the Spree River from the north. The 150th Rifle Division spread out along the bank, looking across at what stood between them and the Reichstag. One bridge, the Moltke Bridge. That was the key. Take that bridge and you're across the river. You're in the heart of the city. You're within striking distance of the target everyone's been fighting toward for weeks. Fail to take that bridge, and you're stuck on the wrong side of the water while other units push ahead. And nobody wanted to be the unit that got left behind when the Reichstag fell. The problem was, the Germans knew exactly how important this bridge was. They'd mined it, barricaded it, positioned machine guns and anti-tank weapons to cover every approach. The Interior Ministry building overlooked it from one side, the diplomatic quarter from the other. Anyone trying to cross would be walking into a crossfire. But orders were orders, and the order was to take that bridge. The first assault went in under a thick blanket of smoke that hung over the entire city. Soviet infantry rushed forward, trying to reach the bridge before the defenders could react. They didn't make it. The German fire was too heavy. Machine guns raked the approaches. Mortars dropped among the attacking troops. A German counterattack pushed the survivors back to their starting positions. The bodies of Soviet soldiers littered the ground in front of the bridge, round one to the defenders. But the Soviets weren't going to stop after one failed attempt. They'd come too far, lost too many men. The Reichstag was right there, visible through the smoke and flames. They could practically touch it. So they tried again, this time with armour. Several massive IS-2 tanks, the Stalin heavy tanks, rolled toward the bridge. These were the biggest, most heavily armoured vehicles in the Soviet arsenal. Thick steel plating, a 122mm gun that could punch through almost anything. If anything could force a crossing, it was these monsters. The tanks rumbled onto the bridge. The infantry followed behind, using the armoured hulls for cover. And then something strange happened. The lead tanks just came apart. One moment they were rolling forward, the next they were exploding, disintegrating. That was the word one German soldier used later. The tanks didn't just get hit, they disintegrated. The surviving crews had no idea what was happening. The fire wasn't coming from the buildings nearby. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't see. Here's what they didn't know. Several miles away, in the grounds of the Berlin Zoo, stood one of the most terrifying weapons in the German arsenal, a flak tower. You've probably never heard of these things, but they were insane. Picture a medieval castle made of reinforced concrete, walls so thick that bombs just bounced off. And on top, instead of archers, you've got massive anti-aircraft guns, 4 twin 128mm cannons designed to shoot down heavy bombers flying at 20,000 feet. These guns were meant to hit aircraft moving hundreds of miles per hour at extreme altitude. Hitting a tank sitting still on a bridge a few miles away? That was nothing. Child's play. The shells came screaming in faster than sound. The tank crews never heard what killed them, just sudden destruction out of nowhere. One German SS soldier named Willy Rogman watched from a defensive position. He saw those Soviet tanks simply cease to exist. Massive vehicles turned to scrap metal in the blink of an eye. The second assault failed. More bodies, more burning vehicles, more Soviet soldiers pulled back to regroup and figure out what the hell just happened. During the pause in fighting, the Germans made their own move. Engineers tried to blow the bridge completely, deny it to the Soviets, force them to find another crossing. The charges went off. The explosion was massive. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge was still there, damaged, partially collapsed on one side, but still standing. A narrow strip of roadway, maybe just wide enough for a single tank, remained passable. The Germans had failed to destroy it completely, and that failure would cost them everything. The Soviets came again, a third assault. This time they'd brought up their own heavy artillery, guns positioned to hammer the defensive positions around the bridge, guns aimed at the Interior Ministry, guns trying to suppress that deadly fire from the flak tower. Under this covering barrage, Red Army tanks pushed forward once more. Infantry crouched behind them, advancing in short rushes. The fire from the German positions was still heavy, but now the defenders were taking hits too. Their machine gun nests were being blown apart. Their anti-tank teams were dying in their positions. One tank made it across, then another. Soviet infantry poured over the narrow remaining strip of roadway, taking casualties with every step but refusing to stop. They'd done it. They had a foothold on the far side of the spree, but the fighting was far from over. Now came the hardest part, clearing the buildings that overlooked the bridge, the Interior Ministry, the diplomatic quarter, room by room, floor by floor. The Interior Ministry was a monster of a building. Even after years of bombing, it was still a fortress. Thick stone walls, multiple floors, hundreds of rooms, and German soldiers dug into every corner, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Soviet assault teams moved in. The tactics were the same ones they'd been using throughout the city. Grenades first, then rush in shooting, check every corner, every closet, every shadow that might hide an enemy. The fighting was brutal. Close quarters, sometimes hand to hand, men dying in hallways, in stairwells, in rooms that had once been government offices, blood on the paperwork, bodies slumped over desks. The Germans fell back, floor by floor, room by room, but they kept fighting. Some of them knew surrender meant death. Others were just too stubborn to quit. Others had nowhere else to go. And then came the breakthrough. It happened at a single window, ground floor, corner of the building. Somehow Soviet troops managed to force an entry point there. Maybe the defenders had been killed. Maybe the wall was weaker at that spot. Whatever the reason, that window became the way in. Word spread through the Soviet lines. That window, that's the way. Go through there. And they did. Thousands of them. Over the course of that night, wave after wave of Soviet soldiers squeezed through that single opening, one window, maybe 3 feet wide, and through it poured an entire army. Think about that for a second. The battle for one of the most important buildings in Berlin came down to one window. History sometimes turns on the smallest hinges. By dawn, on April 29th, the Interior Ministry was secure. The diplomatic quarter had fallen. The Soviet forces now held the south bank of the Spree across from the Reichstag. For the first time in the entire battle, they could see their objective clearly. It was right there, across that flooded construction pit, behind those lines of trenches, the Reichstag, damaged but still standing, still flying whatever ragged flag the Germans had left on it. The route was open, but the hardest 280 meters were still ahead. And then something weird happened. From behind the Soviet lines, from the direction of the Lehrte train station, a group of German soldiers suddenly appeared. They came running through the ruins, weapons in hand, heading straight toward the Reichstag. The Soviet troops were stunned. Where had these guys come from? How had they gotten behind the lines? These were the remnants of the 9th Parachute Division, elite troops, or they had been once. Now they were just survivors, trying to reach their comrades still fighting around the Reichstag. They ran right through the Soviet positions. Some of the Red Army soldiers were so shocked they didn't even fire. Others did, and some of the Germans fell. But most of them made it. They plunged into the German defensive lines around the Reichstag and disappeared. What happened to them after that? Nobody knows for sure. They probably died in the fighting over the next few days. Almost everyone in that final German perimeter did. But for one brief moment they'd pulled off something almost impossible. They'd run straight through an enemy army and lived. War is strange sometimes. By now, Vladimir Pereverzev was somewhere in those forward positions. He'd survived the bridge crossing, survived the fighting in the Interior Ministry. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired. His body was running on nothing but adrenaline and the occasional swig from a canteen that wasn't always filled with water. His unit had taken more casualties. Friends he'd made during the advance were gone now. New faces had appeared to replace them. Men pulled from other units or fresh reinforcements rushed to the front. He barely knew their names, didn't want to learn them. Knowing names made it harder when they died. The Reichstag loomed ahead. He could see it through gaps in the ruined buildings. That dome, or what was left of it. Those columns along the front. The bricked-up windows that would soon be spitting fire at anyone who tried to approach. 500 meters away, he'd told his wife in that letter. Now it was more like 300. Close enough to hit with a thrown rock, close enough to die reaching. The artillery was still falling. It never stopped. Both sides were shelling everything. The Germans were dropping rounds on their own positions now, trying to kill the Soviet troops that had gotten too close. The Soviets were hammering the Reichstag itself, trying to soften up the defences before the final assault. The noise was constant. Explosions, gunfire, screaming, the crash of buildings coming down, the rumble of tanks moving through rubble-filled streets, and under it all that strange silence that comes when you've been in combat so long that your brain starts filtering out the chaos. The world narrows down to what's immediately in front of you. The next piece of cover, the next corner to check, the next breath you're not sure you'll get to take. Vladimir found a spot behind a collapsed wall, checked his weapon, checked his ammunition, tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. Tomorrow was April 30th, the day Stalin wanted that flag flying, the day that everything had been building toward. Somewhere in Moscow, Stalin was waiting. Somewhere in that bunker under the Chancellery, Hitler was giving his final orders. And somewhere in the ruins around the Reichstag, a few hundred exhausted men on each side were preparing for the fight that would decide everything. The night was cold. The fires provided some warmth, but they also made the shadows dance in ways that kept you on edge. Every flicker could be an enemy. Every movement could be your last moment. Vladimir closed his eyes, not to sleep. Nobody was sleeping tonight, just to rest them for a moment. Just to remember what darkness looked like without flames painting it orange. Tomorrow, he would either plant that flag or die trying. Most of the men around him felt the same way. They'd come too far to stop now, bled too much, lost too many friends. The Reichstag was right there, so close they could almost touch it, and in a few hours they were going to try. But let's stay in this moment for a bit, this night before the final push, because there's something worth understanding about what these men were feeling. You'd think the mood would be grim, and in some ways it was, but there was also something else, a strange kind of energy. They were about to do something historic. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would be part of it. The men who took Berlin, the men who ended the war, that meant something. Soldiers talked in low voices, shared cigarettes, passed around whatever food they had. Someone had found a bottle of something, German liquor, probably looted from an abandoned apartment. It made the rounds. Stories were told. About home, about before the war, about what they'd do when it was over. The usual soldier talk. Dreams that might never happen, but felt good to say out loud. Vladimir thought about his village, the smell of bread baking, the sound of his wife singing while she worked. Simple things. Things that seemed impossibly far away in this landscape of rubble and fire. He wondered what she was doing right now. Sleeping, probably. It was the middle of the night in Moscow, too. Was she dreaming? Did she know how close he was to the end? How close he was to either coming home or never coming home at all? Funny how the brain works. In the middle of all this death, all this destruction, you find yourself thinking about bread, about songs, about the way sunlight looked falling through a window on a summer morning. Around him, the other soldiers were doing the same thing, each lost in their own memories, their own hopes, their own fears they wouldn't admit out loud. Some were writing letters, quick notes scribbled in the dark, just in case. Addresses memorized because there was no guarantee the paper would survive even if the writer didn't. Others were checking their equipment for the 100th time, cleaning rifles that were already clean, counting ammunition that had already been counted. Nervous habits, ways to keep the hands busy while the mind tried not to think too hard about what was coming. A few were praying, quietly, privately. The Soviet state didn't approve of religion, but in moments like this nobody was checking. Whatever helped you get through the night, and some were just sitting, staring at nothing, already gone somewhere inside themselves, already preparing for what they'd have to do when the sun came up. The Reichstag stood dark against the orange sky, fires burning somewhere behind it, the columns catching the light in ways that made them look almost peaceful, almost beautiful. If you didn't know what they represented, if you didn't know what it had cost to get here. 300 German soldiers were in that building right now, also not sleeping, also thinking about home, also wondering if they'd see another sunset. The difference was they knew they were going to lose. They knew the men across that open ground outnumbered them by thousands. They knew that no reinforcements were coming, that the war was over in every way that mattered. But they were still there, still manning their positions, still preparing to fight. Why? Some believed in the cause, even now, even with everything in ruins around them. Some were afraid of what would happen if they surrendered. The stories about Soviet treatment of prisoners were terrifying, whether they were true or exaggerated. Some had simply been fighting so long they didn't know how to stop. and some, probably, just wanted to make it mean something. If they were going to die anyway, they'd die fighting. They'd make the enemy pay a price. They'd be remembered as men who stood their ground, not men who gave up. On both sides of that open ground, men were grappling with the same basic questions. What am I willing to die for? What will my death mean? Will anyone remember? These are questions soldiers have asked themselves for as long as there have been wars. They don't have easy answers. Usually they don't have any answers at all. You just do what you have to do and hope that somehow it matters. The hours crept by. The artillery continued its endless rhythm. Crash, whistle, boom, crash, whistle, boom. The heartbeat of a dying city. Somewhere in the Soviet command post, officers were finalizing plans, timelines, objectives, which units would go first, which would follow, where the supporting fire would come from, the bureaucracy of battle. Somewhere in that bunker under the Chancellery, Hitler was awake too, ranting about traitors, demanding impossible things from armies that no longer existed. The last spasms of a regime that had drowned the world in blood. And somewhere in between, in the cellars and the ruins and the trenches, ordinary people waited for dawn. Germans and Russians alike, soldiers and civilians, all caught up in something much bigger than any of them. Vladimir dozed, not quite sleeping, not quite awake. The exhaustion was too deep to ignore, but the adrenaline was too strong to allow real rest. He dreamed, or half-dreamed, about walking through a field of wheat, golden stalks swaying in a warm breeze, his wife beside him, holding his hand, the war a distant memory, something that happened to someone else long ago. Then a shell landed somewhere nearby. The ground shook, the dream shattered. He was back. Berlin. Ruins, fire, the Reichstag waiting in the darkness ahead. A few more hours, that's all. A few more hours until everything changed. The eastern sky was starting to lighten. Not much, just a faint grey at the edges of the black. Dawn was coming, and with it, the final assault. Vladimir checked his rifle one more time, felt the grenades on his belt, took a deep breath of air that tasted like smoke and cordite and something else, something metallic, the taste of fear, maybe, or just the taste of a city being ground to dust. He looked at the men around him, nodded to a few, received nods in return. No words needed. They all knew what was coming. The Reichstag waited, silent, dark, full of men who were just as scared and just as determined as the ones preparing to attack it. In a few hours, many of them would be dead, on both sides. That was the math of war. The only question was who would be left standing when it was over. Vladimir planned to be one of them. Every soldier did. Nobody goes into battle planning to die. You plan to live, to fight, to win, to go home, and then you find out if the universe agrees with your plans. Dawn was almost here. The last dawn of the battle for Berlin. 4:30 in the morning, April 30th. The assault began. Soviet troops pushed out from their positions toward the Reichstag. The goal was to reach that flooded construction site, the water obstacle that sat between them and the building itself. 280 metres of open ground, that's all. About the length of 3 football fields. Today, if you walked that distance, it would take you maybe 5 minutes. A casual stroll. You'd pass tourists taking photos, kids running on the grass, people walking their dogs. In April 1945, that same distance was the most heavily contested stretch of ground in all of Europe. The Soviet infantry moved forward under cover of smoke and the ever-present brick dust that hung in the air. Visibility was awful. You could barely see 20 meters ahead, which was both good and bad. Good because German gunners couldn't aim properly. Bad because you had no idea what you were walking into. They found out fast. The German return fire was murderous. Machine guns opened up from the Reichstag windows. Mortars dropped among the advancing troops. That damned flak tower at the zoo was still operational, still hurling shells at anything that moved. The assault stalled. Men hit the ground looking for any scrap of cover. Some made it to shell craters, others didn't make it anywhere. By 6 a.m, the attack had failed. The Soviets pulled back to their starting positions, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Round 1 to the defenders. Again. Meanwhile, on the German side of the line, a very different kind of drama was playing out. Gunter Debski was 19 years old. A few weeks earlier he'd tried to desert. Can't blame him, really. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. Why die for something that was already over? But they'd caught him. And instead of shooting him, which was the usual punishment, they'd assigned him to a penal battalion. Basically a suicide squad. The kind of unit you send into situations where nobody expects to come back. And now, here he was, April 30th, standing on the south side of the Reichstag, ordered to defend it against the entire Soviet army. There was an SS unit inside the building itself. Gunter's group was supposed to hold the southern perimeter, stop any flanking attacks, buy time for the men inside. Buy time for what? Nobody said. There was nothing left to buy time for, but orders were orders. Then Gunter's commanding officer came up with a brilliant idea. I have received an order to send a negotiating party to the Russians. Gunter couldn't believe what he was hearing. A negotiating party to the Russians in the middle of this. The officer pointed at Gunter and another soldier named Podgorski. You two, take off your undershirt, tie it to a broom handle, go over there and talk to them. My goodness, Gunter thought later. I really thought he was an idiot. Walk across open ground, wave a white flag, try to negotiate with an enemy that outnumbered you by probably 10,000 to 1. An enemy that had spent 4 years fighting their way here, losing millions of men along the way. An enemy that had very good reasons to not be in a forgiving mood. What could possibly go wrong? But before Gunter could figure out how to respond to this insane order, something happened. A shell landed nearby. Maybe Soviet, maybe German. At that point, who could tell? The explosion caught the commanding officer. He went down, mortally wounded. Gunter looked at Podgorski. Podgorski looked at Gunter. The officer who gave the order was dying. Did the order still count? They decided it didn't. The two of them quietly retreated out of sight, found a hole somewhere, hid, waited to see what would happen next. Gunter Debski would survive the war, one of the lucky ones. But in that moment, standing next to the Reichstag with a crazy order ringing in his ears, survival seemed like the longest of long shots. Back on the Soviet side, they were regrouping for another attempt. 11:30 in the morning, a second assault. This one went no better than the first. The fire from the flak tower was relentless. Those massive guns, designed to kill heavy bombers 5 miles up, were now being used to kill men on the ground a few miles away. Every shell was devastating, every hit was fatal. The Soviet infantry pushed forward. Again they were driven back. Again they left bodies on the ground. But something was different this time. The Soviets were learning the German positions, figuring out where the strongest points were, where the machine guns were concentrated, where the anti-tank weapons were hidden. And they were bringing up more artillery, a lot more. By early afternoon, Soviet field guns had been positioned outside the Lehrte train station, an area that today is called Washington Platz. These weren't the massive siege guns that had been pounding the city for days. These were smaller, more mobile weapons, the kind you could wheel into position and fire over open sights. Direct fire, point-blank range, aimed straight at the Reichstag. The bombardment began. Shell after shell slammed into the building. The already damaged facade took hit after hit. Chunks of stone flew through the air. Windows that had been bricked up were blown open again. The gunners inside died at their posts. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the third assault went in. This time the Soviets made progress. The covering fire had done its job. The German machine gun positions were silenced. The 88mm guns in front of the building had been knocked out. The defenders were still fighting, but their fire was weaker now, thinner, more desperate. Soviet infantry reached the water obstacle, the flooded subway construction site, halfway there. But here's where it gets complicated, because while the assault was still in progress, while men were still dying in the open ground in front of the Reichstag, a message was sent to Moscow. The flag is flying over the Reichstag. Stalin received the news. Victory. Finally. The symbol of Soviet triumph over fascism. Except it wasn't true. Nobody knows exactly how this happened. Maybe someone saw a glimpse of red through the smoke and assumed it was a banner. Maybe an overeager officer reported success before it actually happened. Maybe someone just told their superiors what they wanted to hear. Whatever the reason, the message was sent. And now Stalin believed that his forces had already captured the Reichstag, that the hammer and sickle was already flying over the building. When the commanders on the ground realized what had happened, panic set in. You have to understand how the Soviet system worked. If you disappointed Stalin, you didn't just get fired, you disappeared. Your family disappeared. Everyone who knew you learned very quickly to pretend they'd never heard your name. The men who had sent that false report knew exactly what would happen when the truth came out, unless they could make it true before anyone checked. So now, in addition to all the military reasons to capture the Reichstag, there was a new urgency. Cover up the lie, get that flag up there, before Stalin finds out it was never there in the first place. They tried everything. Someone even suggested dropping a banner onto the roof from an aircraft. Just fly over, dump a flag, problem solved. It didn't work. The smoke was too thick. The anti-aircraft fire was still coming from somewhere. The plane couldn't get close enough. The only option was to take the building the hard way. Fight through whatever was left of the defences. Get inside. Get to the roof. Plant the flag for real. But the Germans weren't done yet. Inside the Reichstag, the officer commanding the defence was named Gerhard Babik. He'd watched the Soviet assault reach the water obstacle. He knew his machine guns were being destroyed one by one. He knew his men were running low on ammunition. So he did something desperate. He called for armoured support. Now, in a normal battle, calling for tanks when you're surrounded and running out of ammunition would be pointless. Where would the tanks come from? How would they get through? But this wasn't a normal battle. This was the end. And sometimes, at the end, impossible things happen. A few vehicles actually showed up, several assault guns, and one enormous King Tiger tank from the SS Nordland division. The King Tiger was the heaviest tank Germany had ever built. 68 tons of steel and firepower, an 88mm gun that could destroy any Soviet tank at extreme range, armour so thick that most weapons just bounced off. Inside this beast was a commander named Georg Diers. In his memoir, he described what he saw when he arrived. The Reichstag was a wreck. The main hall had burned out completely. The facade was pockmarked with shell hits, rubble everywhere, and in front of the building near the Kroll Opera House sat about 30 Soviet T-34 tanks, their gun barrels pointed at the Reichstag. At him. 30 tanks. 1 King Tiger. Those weren't good odds. But Georg Diers didn't have time to think about odds. He had a job to do. The crew got a quick briefing. Here's the situation. Here are the targets. Here's what we're going to do. Then they raced around the corner and opened fire. The 88 roared. Soviet tanks started burning. The crew worked frantically, loading and firing as fast as they could. Shell after shell slamming into the enemy vehicles. They scored hits, real damage. Georg Diers would later describe it as a success, but one tank, even a King Tiger, couldn't change the outcome. More and more Soviet armour was pouring across the bridges they'd captured. The Moltke Bridge, the Crown Prince Bridge. Every crossing they'd paid for in blood was now being used to bring in reinforcements. The German counterattack bought time, maybe an hour, maybe less. But it couldn't stop what was coming. As the afternoon wore on, the situation around the Reichstag became increasingly chaotic. Shells falling from both sides, tanks duelling in the rubble-filled streets, infantry fighting in the trenches in front of the building, fire spreading through the upper floors. The Soviet commanders were pushing their men hard. Too hard, some would say later. The pressure from Moscow was immense. That false report had turned a difficult assault into a desperate race against time. Banner parties were being organised, small teams with one specific mission. Get to the roof, plant the flag, make the lie become truth. Several of these teams were already moving toward the building, crawling through the rubble, dodging fire, trying to find a way inside. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon, the orange light mixing with the smoke to create a hellish glow over everything. Vladimir was somewhere in this chaos. His unit had been part of the afternoon assault. They'd made it to the water obstacle, maybe a little beyond. Then they'd been pinned down by fire from the building itself. He was lying in a crater, catching his breath. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same, some wounded, some just exhausted. All of them wondering if they'd live to see the sunset. The Reichstag was right there, maybe 100 meters away now, close enough to see individual windows, close enough to see movement behind the sandbags, so close, and still impossibly far. Someone was shouting orders. Another push. Get ready. We're going again. Vladimir checked his ammunition. Running low. He'd have to be careful with his shots, make each one count. He thought about his wife, about that letter he'd written, about whether she'd ever receive it. Then he pushed himself up out of the crater, started moving forward again. One way or another this was ending today. The Reichstag waited, burning, crumbling, but still standing, and somewhere inside, 300 men waited too. Knowing they were going to die, knowing it was hopeless, fighting anyway, because that's what soldiers do, on both sides. They fight until they can't fight anymore, and sometimes even after that. The final assault was about to begin. But let's pause here for a moment. Let's talk about what that 280 meters really looked like. Because unless you can picture it, you can't understand what these men were being asked to do. The open ground in front of the Reichstag wasn't flat. It was cratered, pockmarked by shells, littered with debris from the surrounding buildings. Mixed in with all that rubble were bodies, German, Soviet, civilian, some fresh, some not. Trenches had been dug across parts of it, some by Germans trying to create defensive positions, some by Soviets trying to get closer without being shot. These trenches were shallow, barely deep enough to protect a man lying down, and they were full of water in places, cold, dirty water mixed with blood and oil and things you didn't want to think about. The flooded subway construction in the middle created this weird barrier, a moat, basically. Not very deep, maybe waist-high in places, but deep enough that you couldn't just sprint through it. You'd have to wade, slowly, while people shot at you. And the fire, always the fire, buildings burning on three sides, the smoke so thick in places you couldn't breathe, the heat so intense you could feel it on your skin from 50 meters away. This is what the Soviet soldiers were looking at. This is what they were being ordered to cross. Not once, but again and again, until either they made it through or there was nobody left to try. Some of them had been fighting since 1941. 4 years of this, Stalingrad, Kursk, the push through Poland and into Germany. They'd seen things that would haunt them forever. They'd done things they'd never talk about. And now, at the very end, they were being asked to do the hardest thing yet. Cross 280 meters of hell to capture a building that didn't really matter except as a symbol. Symbols matter in war. They matter because people need something to fight for that's bigger than themselves. Something that makes all the death and suffering mean something. For Stalin, the Reichstag was that symbol. The place where his flag would fly over the corpse of fascism. The image that would be seen around the world. For the men on the ground, it was simpler. They wanted it to be over. They wanted to go home. And the only way home was through that building. So they kept going, even when the fire was too heavy, even when their friends were dying around them, even when every instinct screamed at them to stay down, stay safe, stay alive. They got up. They moved forward. They died, or they didn't. And then the next wave did the same thing. Vladimir was part of this. One man among thousands, one story among countless others. He'd lost track of time somewhere during the afternoon. The assault at 11:30, the pause to regroup, the third push at 2:30. It all blurred together into one long nightmare of noise and fear and smoke. Now the sun was going down. Maybe 6 o'clock. Maybe later. Hard to tell with all the smoke blocking the sky. His throat was raw from the dust. His eyes stung. His arms ached from carrying his rifle, which somehow seemed heavier now than it had this morning. The men around him were in similar shape. Hollow eyes, 1,000-yard stares, moving on autopilot because conscious thought was too exhausting. But they were still moving, still pushing toward that building, still following orders that came down from somewhere above, from officers who were under pressure from other officers, who were under pressure from Moscow, who were under pressure from Stalin himself. The whole weight of the Soviet state pushing them forward, toward those walls, toward those windows, toward whatever waited inside. They were close now, really close. The water obstacle was behind them. Most of them had made it through somehow, wading through the cold, filthy water while bullets kicked up spray around them. The trenches in front of the Reichstag were just ahead. Some still held German defenders, others had been abandoned, others were full of bodies. Grenades first, then rush forward, clear the trench, move to the next one, repeat. The tactics were simple, brutal, effective. The same thing they'd been doing for weeks, for months, for years. But now it was almost over. The Reichstag was right there. The entrance was visible. The German fire was weakening. Somewhere inside that building men were dying. The artillery had torn the place apart, shells punching through walls, fires burning on multiple floors, the defenders retreating from room to room, fighting for every metre. And somewhere in the Soviet command, officers were watching the clock, watching the sky, wondering if they could make it before dark. Wondering if they could get that flag up there before Stalin started asking questions about that false report. The pressure was immense on everyone, from the lowest private to the highest general. But right now, for Vladimir, the only pressure that mattered was the pressure of staying alive for one more minute, one more step, one more breath. The Reichstag grew larger as he approached. Those columns, that dome, or what was left of it, the windows like dark eyes staring down at him. He thought about his wife again, about going home, about whether home would even recognize him after what he'd become. Then someone shouted, "The final push, everyone up, go, go, go." And he went. One more time into the fire, one more time toward the end. Around 6 in the evening they broke through. Men of the 756th Rifle Regiment reached the main entrance of the Reichstag. The massive doors, already shattered by artillery, hung open like broken jaws. Beyond them, darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, the enemy. Staff Sergeant Ilya Sianov was one of the first through the door. He would later be awarded Hero of the Soviet Union for what happened next. But in that moment, he was just another soldier stepping into the unknown. This is how he described it. Initially, we got into a long hallway. It turned out that the entire enormous building was in motion. Somewhere steps were heard rumbling. Somewhere people were shouting in German. It was not immediately possible to take stock of the situation. One thing was clear. There were a lot of Germans in the building, and we would have to do some fighting. The entire building was in motion. Think about that phrase for a second. It sounds almost poetic. But what it really means is chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. The Reichstag was massive. A labyrinth of rooms and corridors spread across multiple floors, with basements extending deep underground. Hundreds of individual rooms, wide staircases connecting the levels, long hallways that seemed to go on forever, and all of it was on fire. The artillery bombardment had set blazes throughout the building. Some rooms were completely consumed by flames. Others had smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The heat was intense in places, forcing the soldiers to detour around infernos that blocked their path. Somewhere in this nightmare, 300 German defenders were still fighting. They knew every corner, every hiding spot, every doorway that could become an ambush point. The Soviets knew none of it. Ilya and the men with him pushed into that long hallway. Their boots echoed on the stone floor, or maybe they didn't. Maybe the sound was lost in the general roar of fire and gunshots and shouting. They moved carefully at first, checking corners, covering each other, the same tactics they'd been using for months, years. Then the shooting started. Muzzle flashes in the darkness ahead, the crack of rifles, the stutter of submachine guns, men falling, men screaming, the hallway becoming a shooting gallery, just like the streets outside had been. They pushed through anyway. What choice did they have? The only way out was forward. Find the enemy, kill the enemy, or die trying. The fighting inside the Reichstag was unlike anything most of these soldiers had experienced. Even veterans of Stalingrad, where the urban combat had been legendary, found this different. In Stalingrad, you were fighting through apartments, factories, normal buildings with normal layouts. You could develop a sense of the space, understand how it flowed. The Reichstag was a government building, a parliament, designed to impress, not to be practical. Grand halls with soaring ceilings, ornate chambers with columns and galleries, tiny offices tucked behind massive wooden doors, staircases that spiraled up into darkness, basements that seemed to go down forever. Every room was a potential death trap. Every shadow could hide a man with a gun. Every corner could be your last. The Germans fought floor by floor. When they lost a room, they fell back to the next one. When they lost a hallway, they barricaded the stairwell. They knew they couldn't win. They just wanted to make the Soviets pay the highest possible price. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in some places. Rifle butts and bayonets when there wasn't time to aim. Fists and knives when there wasn't room to swing a rifle. Men grappling in the darkness, fighting for their lives with whatever they could grab. The bodies started to pile up, on both sides, slumped against walls, crumpled in doorways, lying in pools of blood that reflected the firelight. Hours passed. The Soviets pushed deeper into the building, one room at a time, one hallway at a time, one floor at a time. By late evening, they'd gained control of most of the ground floor. The Germans who hadn't been killed or captured had retreated upstairs or fled into the basement. The building was split now. Soviets on the ground floor, Germans above and below them. And then something strange happened. The artillery started again. Soviet guns outside began shelling the upper floors of the Reichstag. Their own men were inside the building, but they were shelling it anyway, trying to kill the Germans above before they could counterattack. At the same time, German guns somewhere in the city started hitting the ground floor. Their own men were above and below, but they were shelling the middle anyway, trying to kill the Soviets who'd taken it. Think about that for a second. Both sides were actively shelling a building that their own soldiers were fighting inside. That's how desperate things had gotten. That's how much this building mattered. The night wore on. The fighting continued, room by room, hour by hour. Somewhere in the chaos, a small team of Soviet soldiers found their way to the front of the building, to the main entrance where they'd first broken through hours earlier. They had a flag with them, red, with the hammer and sickle, the symbol Stalin wanted flying over this building by May 1st. It wasn't May 1st yet, still April 30th, but close enough, close enough. The soldiers climbed above the entrance. The facade was shattered, but there were still pieces of structure to hold on to. They worked quickly, knowing that snipers could be watching, knowing that at any moment a bullet could end everything. They didn't have a proper pole, didn't have rope, so they used what they had. Belts. Their own belts, pulled from their waists and lashed around the flag and whatever piece of rubble or metal they could tie it to. And then it was there. The first Soviet banner to fly from the Reichstag. Not the famous one. Not the photograph that would be seen around a world. Just a piece of red cloth tied above a doorway with soldiers' belts. But it was up. The lie sent to Stalin hours earlier was now a truth. Sort of. The fighting wasn't over. Not even close. Inside the building the Germans were still holding. The upper floors, the basement, pockets of resistance that refused to surrender. The Soviets kept pushing, fresh troops arriving to replace the exhausted men who'd been fighting since morning. New faces, new energy, same nightmare. Vladimir was somewhere in this. He'd made it inside. Barely. A bullet had grazed his arm at some point, though he couldn't remember exactly when. The wound wasn't serious, just enough to bleed through his sleeve and remind him how close death had come. He'd lost track of his unit hours ago. Now he was just moving with whoever was nearby, following whoever seemed to know where they were going, which was nobody really. Everyone was equally lost in this maze, His ammunition was gone. He'd picked up a German weapon somewhere along the way, a submachine gun. It felt strange in his hands, but it worked. That was all that mattered. The room he was in had probably been an office once. Desk overturned, papers scattered everywhere. A body in the corner, German, already stiff. Someone was shouting orders. Move up, next floor, clear the stairwell. He moved. What else was there to do? The stairwell was narrow, dark, perfect for an ambush. He went up slowly, weapon first, ears straining for any sound. A shape moved above him. He fired. The shape fell. German or Soviet? In the darkness, there was no way to tell until you got close. German. Young. Maybe Volkssturm. Maybe regular army. Did it matter anymore? He kept climbing. Another floor. More hallways. More rooms. More bodies. The night seemed endless. Fighting in darkness lit only by fires and muzzle flashes, the building creaking and groaning around them as the flames ate away at its structure. At some point Vladimir found himself near a window. He looked out. The city spread before him, burning in a dozen places. The sky was orange. The smoke was thick enough to taste. He thought about his wife, about whether she'd ever know what happened to him if he died in this building. Would anyone even find the letter in his pocket? Would anyone bother to send it? Probably not. He was one man among millions, one body among thousands. History wouldn't remember his name, but that was okay. He wasn't fighting to be remembered. He was fighting to survive, to get home, to see her face one more time. He turned away from the window, raised his weapon, kept moving. The hours blurred together. Midnight came and went. April 30th became May 1st, the date Stalin had wanted. The flag was flying now, more or less. But the building wasn't secure, not even close. The Germans in the basement were holding out. The ones on the upper floors too. They had no hope of victory, no chance of rescue, but they kept fighting anyway. Some of them believed in the cause, even now. Some of them were afraid of what would happen if they surrendered. Some of them just didn't know how to stop. The Soviets kept grinding forward. They'd come too far to stop now. Too many men had died to give up on the doorstep of victory. Grenades into darkened rooms, bursts of gunfire at shadows, screams and silence, over and over again. The building was a horror show by now. Bodies everywhere, blood on the walls, smoke so thick in places that you couldn't breathe without choking, fire eating through the floors, making some areas impassable, but still they fought, both sides, clinging to every room, every hallway, every stairwell, because this building meant something. To Stalin, to the German leaders still hiding in their bunker nearby, to the soldiers on both sides who needed to believe that all this death had a purpose. Symbols matter. People die for symbols. In the Reichstag on April 30th and into May 1st, 1945, a lot of people were dying for a symbol. The first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows. May 1st, International Labour Day, the date Moscow had demanded. The flag was still flying above the entrance, ragged now, smoke-stained, but still there. Inside, the fighting continued. The Germans were running low on ammunition, running low on men, running low on everything except stubbornness. But they were still fighting, and the Soviets were still coming, one room at a time, one life at a time. Vladimir had stopped counting the hours, stopped counting the rooms, stopped counting anything. He just moved, fought, survived. Repeat. His arm hurt where the bullet had grazed him. His throat was raw from smoke. His eyes stung. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline and fear. but he was still alive, still moving, still fighting. The Reichstag groaned around him, fire crackling somewhere above, gunshots echoing somewhere below, and somewhere outside the sun was rising on a new day, May 1st, the day of victory. At least that's what they were calling it in Moscow. Here, inside this burning building, victory still seemed very far away. But it was coming, hour by hour, room by room, it was coming. But let's slow down here. Let's talk about what those 30-plus hours inside the Reichstag really meant. Because this wasn't just a battle. It was an ordeal. A test of endurance that pushed men far beyond anything they'd experienced before. The Reichstag had been built to impress. Massive stone columns, soaring ceilings. Grand chambers designed to hold hundreds of politicians. None of it had been designed for what was happening now. The fire was the worst part. Not the bullets, not the grenades. The fire. It had started from the artillery barrage, incendiary rounds, high explosives that ignited whatever they touched. By the time the Soviets entered the building, flames had already consumed large sections of the upper floors, and fire in a building like this doesn't just burn, it spreads. It finds cracks and air channels and climbs higher, reaches further. The heat rises, making the upper floors unbearable. The smoke sinks into the lower levels, filling them with choking darkness. Men fought in this, breathing through wet cloth pressed over their faces, eyes watering, throats burning, skin blistering when they got too close to the flames. Some rooms became ovens, the heat so intense that no one could enter. These had to be bypassed, left to burn themselves out. The Germans learned to use them as barriers, positioning themselves on the far side, forcing the Soviets to find another route. Water would have helped, but there was no water. The city's systems had been destroyed days ago. Fire hoses were useless without pressure. Buckets were useless without wells, so the fire burned, and the men fought around it, through it, despite it. Sleep was impossible. Not that anyone had time to try. The fighting was constant, 1 hour bleeding into the next with no break, no pause, no moment to close your eyes. Food was whatever you could find, whatever was in your pockets, whatever some comrade shoved into your hands, hardtack and sausage and stolen bread, eaten in moments between firefights. Water was scarce too. Canteens ran dry, throats parched. Some men drank from puddles on the floor, not caring what might be mixed with the water. This was survival at its most basic. Kill or be killed. Keep moving or die where you stood. The German defenders were suffering just as badly, maybe worse. They'd been fighting longer, with less support, with no hope of relief. Some of them were wounded and still fighting. Some of them had been awake for days. Some of them were so dehydrated they could barely stand, but they kept going, falling back room by room, stairwell by stairwell, making the Soviets pay for every meter. There was something almost admirable about it. If you could step back from the horror, if you could forget for a moment who these men were fighting for, there was something admirable about their stubborn refusal to quit. Of course, stepping back wasn't really possible. Not when bullets were flying, not when friends were dying, not when the whole world seemed to be on fire. The basement was its own kind of nightmare. Dark, cramped, filled with the smell of smoke and blood and fear. Soviet teams probed down there throughout the night. Short firefights in pitch-black corridors, grenades bouncing off walls before exploding, screams echoing in the confined spaces. The Germans had fortified well. They knew the layout. They'd set up barriers and firing positions. They made the attackers pay for every step. Some Soviet soldiers refused to go down there at all. Better to wait, starve them out, let them surrender when they ran out of ammunition. Others didn't have that patience. The pressure from above was too intense. Take the building, all of it, now. So they went down into the darkness, and many of them didn't come back up. Above ground, on the upper floors, a different kind of battle played out. More open spaces, more room to maneuver, but also more fire, more collapsed ceilings, more floors that might give way at any moment. The Soviets used the same tactics they'd developed in Stalingrad. Move through walls when possible. Avoid the obvious doorways. Let grenades do the work of clearing a room before you enter. But the Reichstag was built stronger than apartment buildings. The walls were thicker, harder to punch through. Sometimes they had to use the doors, the hallways, the open spaces. That's when the casualties mounted fastest. Through it all, that first flag kept flying above the entrance. Wind-torn, bullet-holed, but still there. A scrap of red cloth that somehow meant everything and nothing at the same time. Other flags would be raised later, on higher parts of the building, in better positions for photographs. But that first one, the one lashed up with soldiers' belts in the chaos of April 30th, that was the real victory flag. The men who put it there didn't become famous. Their names aren't in the history books. They were just soldiers doing a job, trying to survive long enough to see the morning. Some of them did, some of them didn't. That's how war works. Random chance mixed with skill, mixed with luck. You never know which bullet has your name on it until it's too late. Dawn on May 1st brought new hope. Fresh light filtering through the shattered windows, fresh air mixing with the smoke, making it slightly easier to breathe. The flag was still flying, the building was still contested, but the tide was clearly turning. German resistance was weakening, their ammunition running out, their numbers dwindling. Men surrendering now where they would have fought to the death hours earlier. Some still held out, diehards in the basement, fanatics on the upper floors, men who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. But most were done. Most had reached the end of their endurance. Most just wanted it to be over. In the cellars beneath the city, civilians were still hiding, still waiting, still wondering what would happen when they finally emerged. Some had heard the fighting move away from their buildings. Others could still hear it, right overhead, shaking dust from the ceiling. Gerda, the 17-year-old girl we mentioned earlier, was in one of those cellars. She'd been there for days now, waiting, praying, trying not to think about what was happening above. The sounds had changed overnight. The artillery had slowed. The gunfire had moved. Something was different. But she didn't dare go up to look. Not yet. Not until she was sure. So she waited, like everyone else, while the battle for the Reichstag raged on without her. In the building itself, Vladimir had found a moment of quiet. A small room, already cleared, already littered with bodies. He sat against a wall, knees pulled up trying to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from exhaustion, from the accumulated shock of hours of continuous fighting. He looked at them, caked with grime, blood under the fingernails. Cuts and scrapes he didn't remember getting. These were his hands, the same hands that had held his wife, that had worked his father's fields before the war, that had written letters home and dealt cards and done all the ordinary things of an ordinary life. Now they were instruments of killing, nothing more. He wondered if they'd ever feel normal again, if he'd ever feel normal again, or if this was just who he was now, a soldier, a killer, a survivor. The sun climbed higher, the fighting continued, but something was changing now. The German fire was thinner, the resistance weaker. They were almost there. After 30 hours of hell, they were almost there. Vladimir pushed himself up, checked his weapon, started moving again. One more push, that's all. One more push, and it would be over. He stepped back into the smoke and noise and chaos. The Reichstag was falling, hour by hour, room by room. It was almost done. May 2nd, 30 hours after the first Soviet soldiers entered the Reichstag. The last German defenders finally stopped fighting. They didn't stop because they wanted to. They stopped because they couldn't continue. Out of ammunition, out of food, out of water, out of everything except stubbornness, and even that had finally run dry. The survivors emerged from the basement and the upper floors, hands raised, eyes hollow, covered in dust and blood and the grime of days without washing. About 300 men had defended that building. By the time it was over, 200 of them were dead. The remaining 100 stumbled out into the daylight, blinking against the sun, waiting to find out what came next. Around the Reichstag, the rest of Berlin was also surrendering. Soldiers emerging from basements and bunkers all across the city, white flags appearing in windows, the sound of gunfire finally fading to silence. The battle was over. After 16 days of some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, Berlin had fallen. Vladimir was still alive. He couldn't quite believe it. Standing in the ruins outside the Reichstag, watching the German prisoners file past, he kept touching his chest, his arms, his face, making sure he was real, making sure this wasn't some dream he'd wake up from. The bullet graze on his arm had stopped bleeding. His throat was raw. His eyes burned. Every muscle in his body ached with a tiredness that went deeper than bone. But he was alive. All around him, other Soviet soldiers were having the same realization. Men who'd been fighting for years, who'd watched their friends die, who'd given up hope of ever seeing home again. They were standing in the heart of the enemy's capital, and the enemy was done. Some were laughing, some were crying, some were just standing there, staring at nothing, trying to process what had happened. Vladimir thought about his wife, about the letter in his pocket. He'd mail it now. He'd write another one too, tell her he was coming home. Home. The word felt strange, foreign, like something from another lifetime. But it was real now. For the first time in 4 years, home was actually possible. A few days later, a photographer arrived at the Reichstag. His name was Yevgeny Kaldey. He worked for the Soviet news agency, and he'd been sent to capture an image of victory. The fighting was over by then. The building was secure, but Kaldey needed the perfect shot, something that would show the world what the Soviet Union had accomplished. He found some soldiers, got them to climb up onto the roof of the Reichstag, gave them a flag he'd brought with him, a big red banner with the hammer and sickle. Then he positioned himself and started shooting. The photograph he took that day would become one of the most famous images of the entire Second World War. You've probably seen it. A Soviet soldier holding a flag, arm outstretched, silhouetted against the smoke rising from the ruins of Berlin. It's a powerful image, iconic, the kind of photograph that defines an era. It's also staged. The fighting had been over for days by the time that picture was taken. The flag in the photograph wasn't the first one raised over the Reichstag. That was the one lashed up with soldiers' belts on the night of April 30th. This was a recreation, a posed shot for the cameras. And there's another detail, a small one, but interesting. If you look at the original photograph, the soldier holding the flag is wearing 2 watches, one on each wrist. This was edited out of the official version. Someone in Moscow decided it looked bad. 2 watches suggested looting, suggested that maybe the victorious Soviet army wasn't quite as disciplined as the propaganda wanted people to believe. So they airbrushed 1 watch away, cleaned up the image, made it fit the story they wanted to tell. That's how history works sometimes. The real moments are messy, chaotic, complicated. The images we remember are cleaned up, simplified, turned into symbols. The first flag over the Reichstag was tied up with belts by exhausted men in the middle of a firefight. Nobody photographed it. Nobody recorded their names. It was just something that happened in the chaos. The famous photograph came later, posed, staged, edited. Both are real in their own way. Both are true. But they tell very different stories. The cost of taking Berlin was staggering. Nobody knows the exact numbers. Records were incomplete. Bodies were buried in mass graves or never found at all. But the estimates are horrifying. Between 80 and 100,000 Soviet soldiers died in the battle. Maybe more. That's in addition to the hundreds of thousands wounded. About 100,000 German troops fell, military and militia alike. The Volkssturm grandfathers and the Hitler Youth children counted the same as the veterans in the final tally. And then there were the civilians. Perhaps 20,000 Berliners died in those 16 days, killed by artillery, killed in crossfires, killed in the cellars when buildings collapsed above them. 200,000 people, maybe more, gone in just over 2 weeks. That's what it cost to capture a city that everyone already knew was lost. That's the price of symbols. In the days after the surrender, the Reichstag became a kind of pilgrimage site for Soviet soldiers. Men who'd fought their way across a continent wanted to see the building they'd heard so much about. The heart of the fascist state, as the propaganda had called it. They came in waves, thousands of them, and they left their marks. All over the walls of the Reichstag, Soviet soldiers wrote their names, carved them into the stone, chalked them on the walls, left messages and dates and unit numbers. Some of the graffiti was triumphant. We made it. Berlin is ours. Death to fascism. Some was simpler, just names and hometowns. Even from Smolensk was here. Sergei, May 1945. Small traces of individual lives in the middle of something enormous. When Western journalists finally arrived in Berlin weeks later, the graffiti was still there. They photographed it, wrote about it, showed the world what Soviet soldiers had done to the parliament building of their greatest enemy. Some of that graffiti is still there today. If you visit the Reichstag now, restored and functioning as the German parliament again, you can still see traces of those messages from 1945. They've been preserved deliberately, a reminder of what happened here. The city healed, eventually. It took years, decades. The rubble was cleared. New buildings rose where the old ones had been destroyed. The wall went up, dividing east from west, and then it came down again. Today, Berlin is one of the great cities of Europe. Modern, vibrant, full of life. If you walk the route that Soviet soldiers took in April 1945, you'd never know what happened there. The Moltke Bridge has been rebuilt. The area in front of the Reichstag is now called the Square of the Republic. Tourists take photos in front of the Brandenburg Gate. The water obstacle, that flooded subway construction that caused so many deaths, is long gone. Filled in and built over. The trenches have disappeared. The shell craters have been smoothed away. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. The battle-damaged griffin that once decorated the Moltke Bridge has been preserved. You can see the scars from that April fighting still visible on its surface. On the roof of the Reichstag itself, fragments of Soviet graffiti remain. Names and dates from 1945 fading but still legible, and throughout the city memorials mark the places where men fell. German memorials, Soviet memorials, monuments to the civilians who died in the crossfire. Berlin remembers. Even when the physical evidence has been erased, the memory remains. Vladimir went home after the war. At least we can imagine he did. The real Vladimir Pereverzev, the one who wrote that letter about the kitchen ceiling and the 6-story building that collapsed on his unit, he disappears from the historical record after April 1945. Maybe he survived. Maybe he didn't. The records don't say. But let's say he did. Let's say he made it through those final days, through the chaos of victory, through the long journey back to wherever home was. Let's say he saw his wife again, held her, told her everything, or tried to tell her. Some things can't really be explained to someone who wasn't there. Let's say he lived a long life, raised children, grew old, became one of those veterans who marched in parades on Victory Day, medals clinking on a chest that had once dodged bullets in the ruins of Berlin. We don't know for sure, but we can hope. That's what history leaves us with sometimes. Hope, and questions that will never be answered. The battle for Berlin was the last great battle of the European war. Within a week of the Reichstag's fall, Germany surrendered completely. The fighting in Europe was over. It had cost something like 70 million lives across 6 years, soldiers and civilians, victims and perpetrators, people who chose to fight and people who just got caught in the middle. Berlin was the final chapter, the last bloodletting, the place where it all finally stopped. And now, here we are, 80 years later. The men who fought there are almost all gone now. The buildings they destroyed have been rebuilt. The world has moved on to new conflicts, new crises, new concerns, but the story remains. The story of how 2.5 million Soviet soldiers cracked open the most heavily defended city in Europe. How they crossed the rivers and the heights and the trenches, how they fought through the streets and the buildings and the rooms, how they planted a flag on a ruined parliament and declared victory. It's a story about symbols and sacrifice, about orders and obedience, about the terrible things men do to each other and the stubborn human will to survive. It's also a story about individuals, about Vladimir writing letters to his wife, about Gunter Debski hiding from a crazy order, about Ilya Sianov stepping into a dark hallway full of enemies, about Georg Diers racing his tank around a corner to face 30 Soviet guns. These were real people. They had families and fears and hopes just like anyone else. They got caught up in something bigger than themselves, something they couldn't control, and they did what they had to do to get through it. Some made it, some didn't. That's always how it goes. The Reichstag stands today, rebuilt, restored. The glass dome on top lets light pour down into the chamber below. Tourists line up to climb the spiral walkway and look out over the city. Below them, the ghosts of April 1945 are quiet now. The shouting has stopped. The gunfire has faded. The fires have long since burned out. It's peaceful there. Hard to imagine it any other way. But if you close your eyes and listen carefully, maybe you can still hear echoes. Boots on stone floors, German voices and Russian voices shouting at each other in the darkness, the crack of rifles, the rumble of tanks, echoes of a battle that ended 80 years ago but somehow never quite goes away. That's the story of how the Soviets cracked Berlin. The real story, with all its chaos and courage and horror and humanity. Now the night has grown quiet around you. Your bed is warm. Your pillow is soft. The world outside is at peace, at least for now. Those soldiers who fought through hell to capture that building, they would have given anything for a night like this. A safe place to rest, a moment of silence, the simple comfort of knowing that tomorrow nobody would be shooting at them. You have that tonight. Hold on to it, appreciate it, and as sleep comes, let the story fade. Let Berlin drift away. Let the soldiers rest finally, after all these years. They earned it, and so have you. Good night.